Again, it's an honor to introduce Didi, whom I've known for just a few years, but I consider her to be a mentor and just a light out there doing really good work. Didi is the founder of the Land and Leadership Institute, educator, an author. She's written the Ecology of Care and Understanding Soil Health and Watershed Function, which is a great resource book. So I'm going to hand it over to Didi right now and let her go for it.
Great. Thank you all for having me. I'm going to have a noisy playing dog here, maybe. Your work has been really inspiring to me in terms of getting things done well. And I know that a lot of the consensus work that Jeff and others are doing is a big part of making things work. And I kind of want to keep that in the background of what I'm going to talk about is how do we create trust between people, and what does that look like? And that's something that I'll be talking about tomorrow with Precious Piri from Zimbabwe, about her work in that way. But I'm going to start with a story that is sort of a challenging story in those ways, to show one place where I ended up at one point. This was probably 3 years ago. I think it was 2016, 2017. And I'm sitting in the Yale Club, in the breakfast room at the Yale Club with an agricultural economist. And I am tagging along with him for a meeting before we go to another meeting with the UN Foundation. And he says, if you want, you can come and have breakfast with me. I'm meeting with an investor. So we're sitting there. Okay, this is real life on Zoom. I have to let my dog out for a pee. No reason to stop this story. This guy comes in wearing a plaid suit, and he sits down and introduces himself, and he says, I've made a lot of money in bad ways, and I don't care whether it goes to something good or bad. I just want to invest it. And I'm like, whoa. Luckily, I'm just the sort of innocent bystander at this meeting. And what he's interested in is investing in chocolate. So this agricultural economist talks him through the whole economy of chocolate, which I had never heard before. And but really what he's talking about is the history of land degeneration and the unlikelihood that this can continue, because he's saying, well, you could invest in chocolate in this region, but there's drought, the soils have become very poor, it's not really going to pan out in the long run. And he goes through all of these different places in the world, mostly on the African continent, and he's describing how, because of water issues and soil degradation issues, that there is no real investment that's going to make sense anymore. So the guy is sort of starting to give up, and he turns to me and he says, what do you think? So I paused, and luckily I had learned from a colleague to bring with me printed out photographs, because you can't always pull your computer up. And very slowly, I slid this picture across the table, and I didn't say a word. And he looked at it, and he looked at it some more. And he said, do you know what they put on the left-hand side? What chemicals they put there? Can I invest in that? And I said, they didn't put any chemicals. And he said, do you know what kind of a water system they put in there? And I said, there's no water system that they put in. There's nothing added here. There's no technology that did this. And he said, do you know how to do this? And I said, I know people who do. So there's a few pieces to that story that are interesting to me. One is, why would I be interested in even talking to somebody like that with an opening line about having made money in bad places? And part of that is that both my upbringing and a lot of the work that I've done over the last 30 years, which started, and I'll get into that in a minute, started with being a healthcare provider. I have been taught and have had confirmed that all people are always doing the best they can with the background, the history, the life experience, and the information that they have at that moment. And that if you speak to the human being in there, which sometimes is very far away underneath piles and piles of wretched pattern and the automatic behaviors and et cetera, but if you can speak to the human being in there, then things change and people change. So the other thing that I think is really interesting, and I've seen this and I know many of you have seen this, is that people often make decisions for financial reasons, but because of something called biophilia, which is the human connection to land, to others, to living things, to other living things, that when people start doing regenerative agriculture or start doing agriculture that brings back biodiversity, whether it's plants or animals or both, and usually it's both if it's being done well, they fall in love with the land. They fall in love with the world again. And even some very hard-hearted people or people whose hearts have hardened soften up when they see a landscape that's really working. It's like they've forgotten what that is. So so I sort of jumped in the middle of my story, but I want to backtrack now. This was the other slide that then I showed him, which is another one I carry around with me, and explained that these are 5 different soil type, five different plugs of the same soil type, but under different management. So it's sort of another version of that previous slide. And you can see the difference in water in terms of the infiltration. Those jars in the back are the water that's actually infiltrating down to the plant roots, and the water in the front is what's run off, and including the soil that's run off. So another teaching piece. But where I started was as a healthcare provider, a holistic healthcare provider. So looking at people as whole systems, but not necessarily too interested in land, other than that I was very interested in holistic nutrition. So I worked with a lot of farmers. I'm in a rural area in Vermont, and very interested in Weston Price's work, who was a dentist long ago, who noticed that people who ate whole foods diets with products from grazing animals, so milks and meats, etc., as well as a bunch of other traditional foods, that their teeth would not rot into old age. They would have healthy, beautiful teeth, and their jaws would fit their faces. And their whole bone structure and their other markers of health, heart disease, cancer, etc., were all far different than once they got onto an industrial food diet. So a lot of my work was working with my clients to get them to change to eating local, high nutrient foods from farms that were doing good work. So, and I was writing a book that I started writing in 2006, thinking about sustainability in healthcare and connections between environmental health and human health. So, but it was still very much focused on human health. And while I was in the middle of writing this book, whose working title was called Sustainable Medicine, we had a really interesting event in Vermont. So this is the Untitled River behind my house where I swim every day. We're in a very wet area, but one year in the fall when we were not expecting it, the Untitled River and all of the other rivers around in Vermont were hit really hard by Tropical Storm Irene, and we had just unbelievable flood damage. So before this hit, I had thought of climate change as an issue of just warming, and I thought, well, in Vermont, we could use things to be a little bit warmer. But after this, I understood climate change to be really much more about water. And at this point, I understand that in a much broader sense. So it's really even more about water than it's necessarily just about carbon. But following that storm, seeing my own river become filled with propane tanks that had washed down the river, and seeing all of these roads wash out, we have 75% of our roads in Vermont are dirt roads, and we lost hundreds and hundreds of miles of roads and hundreds of bridges, including a lot of our historic bridges. So seeing all of this, I started to, everywhere I drove, I started to think, what's going to happen the next time we get a storm like that? What's going to happen to our infrastructure? What's going to happen to the healthcare system if we can't get somewhere with an ambulance, or we spend all our money repairing roads and we no longer have a town budget, with a town of just 2,000 people, for example. So I became very, very interested both in sort of resilience to flooding and in this interaction between soil and water. And I was still writing this book. It took me 9 years to write this book. And I was trying to tie it all together. And I came across this book in our local bookstore by a local Vermont author. I don't know why you guys are on a Vermont theme in New Mexico with your soil stories. And this is Judith Schwartz, who I think spoke a few weeks back or a couple months back with you. And as I read this book, I got about halfway through, and I had two big realizations. One was that I had figured out how to tie together all the different themes that I knew were connected, and I had been trying to put together in my book, but I couldn't quite figure it out how to do that. And this tied it all together for me. The other big realization I had was around, I don't know, page 150 or something. I said, this is what I want to do with the rest of my life. And I literally, the next day, got up, called a friend of mine and said, who do you know who's working in this soil thing? And they introduced me to a group of people, and those folks were heading to the Northeast Organic Farming Association conference very soon after that. Elaine Ingham was the keynote speaker. I went to a workshop with someone named Peter Donovan, and he said he was looking for people to learn how to do monitoring. And so I said, why don't you come, I'll set up a workshop and you can teach people here in my town. It ended up being a not very popular workshop, and my sons and I and one other friend, who was a local teacher, were the only participants. But this is the Soil Carbon Coalition, which Peter and Jeff and Abe and a variety of other folks started back or around the same time that I was starting to write my book. They were getting going with this project of monitoring changes in soil carbon, soil health, and water infiltration at really successful ranches and farms across North America. So I learned how to do this monitoring, which I figured was a place that I could jump in and get involved without having to go back to school. So I'm more of a mental person than a physical person. So it was pretty challenging, but it was a great, interesting, fun challenge to do this. And I told my patients who were used to me doing acupuncture on them, I said, don't worry, I'm still sticking long, sharp metal objects into living systems. I'm just going to be doing it on a different scale. So, and my nice clinic turned into a laboratory. And I started traveling with Peter Donovan across North America whenever I could get away. I'd fly out and meet him and travel for a few weeks at a time. And we went way up into northern Alberta. We went to Saskatchewan. We went to New Mexico. We went to Colorado. We went to California. And in all of that, I got this incredible in-depth education, really, listening to these farmers, sitting around their tables with them, hearing what they were facing, hearing what they were excited about, getting my hands right in the soil, and learning the language. I mean, there was a lot of language of farming and ranching that I needed to learn in order to be able to turn around and talk to people. And languages have been an interest of mine all along. Studied languages in college and hadn't really thought of it in this way until I got out there, but that really part of what I needed to do was to know the language of what the equipment is, what all the challenges are, what all of the different practices are, etc. So when we were up in Saskatchewan, we did the plot where we found this, I think this may still be some of the front runners in the soil carbon challenge, Ralph and Linda Corcoran. Their soil was gaining 13 tons of carbon per hectare per year, and that is the equivalent on a square mile of that of 800 people's annual CO2 emissions from their region, from Canada. I think maybe it might be fewer people if it was the US, but that was impressive, and there was all this excitement about soil carbon, which there still is, but a sort of an interesting thing happened. Peter would typically teach this. We would be teaching workshops as we went across the country, and Peter would be teaching the carbon monitoring, and I would teach water infiltration. And then we'd just, kind of talk at the end of the day about how that had gone. And I noticed that there were more interesting conversations and more kind of people being willing to get excited or get involved around the water piece than around the carbon piece. And that was my sense as well. I mean, that was what brought me in, was the water piece. It was the flooding. I had not been interested in drawdown or carbon, et cetera, until I understood its relationship to water. So I suggested that we kind of tweak our focus towards water, even though we were called the Soil Carbon Coalition. And what I thought was that I could do there was, and again, I was looking for some way that I could contribute without necessarily going back to grad school. So I decided to write a grant to start creating a curriculum around soil health and watershed function. And this is just noting that as I was traveling, but I was seeing things on the ground, but I was also getting this incredible view of our continent and what's going on with water. So I always got a window seat, and I would just have my face pressed to the window. And this was really part of my education, was these unbelievable visuals that then I would arrive wherever I was and show people what I had been looking at out the window. So I thought I would get one, big grant and just write this curriculum. It turned out I needed to get about 10 tiny grants, and was still scrounging around for cash. But I spent a few years testing out different exercises, including some of the stuff that we were already doing with water infiltration testing, the observation hoop. So I was testing with all different ages, all different people. This is kindergartners learning to figure out how, what are the how many different species are in there, how much bare ground is there, et cetera. Bulk density testing to see like how compacted a soil is, whether water can flow in or not. Again, the soil carbon testing, setting up a transect and mapping. And this is again in Chicago, looking at how to orient yourself on the land so that you can find your transect again. I came up with lots of fun games and ways to do things throughout this process. I'm one of those like fly by the seat of your pants type people who just get in with the group and we'll just start playing and see what happens. But by far the most popular thing that I came up with, which many of you have probably seen, is this demonstration of flour versus bread as a demonstration for soil structure and soil function. We talk about degraded soil as being like flour, and when you pour water on it, the water runs off the top, it doesn't soak in, it creates flooding followed by a drought. There's a lot of erosion, etc. And when you rain onto bread, which is like a well aggregated soil that has had life in it, the water soaks in, no erosion, etc. But I'm going to let a student of mine show this. Emmeline Conkey grew up in a trailer in a town near here, and when and I suggested that people in the class, this is a class that I just got a substitute teaching gig in order to try things out on an environmental studies class, and I suggested that everybody try making a video for the Khan Academy video contest on something related to soil and water. Now, the only person who took me up was Emmeline, and but her demo really was kind of extraordinary. We thought she was kind of like the new maven of soil explanations. So try that again.
So this is a quick little demonstration just to compare aggregated soil versus unaggregated soil. So our flour here represents our poorly aggregated soil. It doesn't have a lot of pore spaces, and our bread has all these nice little pore spaces in it, so our water infiltrates really, really well. So this is a styrofoam cup, poked a few holes in it to simulate rain. First I'm going to do over the flour, just so you can see, just kind of runs right off, doesn't really go through, runs off, carries all these particles with it, like poorly aggregated soil would do if it were to rain naturally. All this stuff would end up in our streams and our lakes, and that's not healthy. But over our bread, you can see that most of it is absorbed almost instantly all the way through. You see, even if it were to rain really heavily, or if there were to be a flood, still enters relatively well, versus, well, you come back over here to flour, it's just running off and taking everything with it. So that's a quick analogy to see how different soil types would work. So pore spaces, again, infiltration, all the way through, pore infiltration, everything just kind of runs off. That's pretty much it.
So I ended up bringing Emmeline and another student to this water conference at Tufts University, and let them give a longer explanation, including that video, about the soil sponge, though we didn't have that word for it yet. We were talking about flour and bread, we were talking about aggregation. And at this same conference was a scientist named Walter Jena, who got up and was talking about the soil sponge. And right afterwards, we all sort of got together, and he said, "That's exactly what I was trying to explain." And we said, "That's the right word for it." And it was also right after Emmeline's demonstration. There's all these scientists from around the world who've been trying to talk about water and landscape function, and they just gave this big standing ovation, because it was like, there's all this language, all these words, all these, explanations, and she just nails it with this demo. So I was really pleased. I was really pleased with that whole scene there, and that was kind of the beginning of this demonstration that I had come up with based on a casual comment by Peter that, well, healthy soils more like bread and unhealthy soils like flour. So then I had picked it up. Emmeline had made this video, and Christine Jones, who's a soil scientist from Australia, who some of you may have met, saw that video at that same conference and said, "Can I use this video when I'm teaching?" So suddenly this kind of got spread around different conferences around the world. They asked me to present it at Kavira with Christine. And it's kind of become this very, very quick, easy way to get across a whole bunch of ideas. So that's become my gold standard of, like, when I teach, I try to figure out ways to really give a visual thing that shows a system at work. And so then, this is just the craziest journey, considering that I started as an acupuncturist. Soon after that, I get a call from someone, and I had been at another conference. At this point, my book had come out, the curriculum had come out. I was starting to get invited to speak at a lot of conferences, and I'd been at one with Christine Jones and a bunch of other people who I now knew well. And I thought, I'm not going to answer my phone or email while I'm here. I'm just going to relax and enjoy the conference and enjoy seeing these people. And I came home to a slew of messages from the United Nations who wanted me to come and give a 7-minute talk on World Soil Day. And they had already found somebody else because they couldn't get in touch with me. And then that didn't work out. So then I had like 24 hours notice to come up with a 7-minute speech and to get myself to New York, which I did. And because of that talk, I started getting a lot of emails from the UN, including saying, "Do you want to contribute to this next volume, et cetera," assuming that I was, an important scientist, et cetera. So I said, okay, sure. So I started working on a chapter about what's new with soil carbon for one of their publications. And in doing that, I came across something called the Farmer Field School program that a colleague told me about. And I sent them my curriculum because it was their curriculum was very, very similar in terms to mine. And they were very excited by it and said, "This is great. We're going to share it with our people." So a few months later, this is now just last year, I got an email inviting me to come develop curriculum in India for this program called the Zero Budget Natural Farming Initiative. And this is an extraordinary story that I will finish with, because in some ways it's just the opposite of that original story. It's not the single investor who decides that they're going to do some, either destroy a landscape or regenerate a landscape. This started 25 years ago when a bureaucrat from India named Vijay Kumar decided to help set up a program where women would organize each other into women's self-help economic groups. And there are now millions of women across India who are all or pre-organized into these groups that give each other microloans and savings, etc., to do projects. And they'll take on various projects that they're interested in regionally or as the whole women's self-help economic group movement. And many years after he had helped set that program up, Vijay found out about something called zero budget natural farming, which was a very small movement at that point, but it was trying to unhook farmers from inputs, and so that they would be growing food only using cow dung, cow urine, local inputs, cover crops, etc. And no GMO seed, no bought seed at all, no fertilizers, etc. And he created some videos and brought them to the women's self-help groups and asked them if they wanted to take this up. So now they're in this one state in India, in Andhra Pradesh, there's a project going where they have gotten, I think when I first heard about it, it was 500,000. Now I think it's 800,000 farmers to adopt zero budget natural farming, and they are on target to turn the entire state of Andhra Pradesh into a zero budget natural farming state. So the UN contacted me to see if I would go help this project develop curriculum. At the same time, they had seen the video of our conference in Vermont with Walter Jena speaking about water and as a climate cooling factor, and how green growing landscapes and the soil sponge can provide local cooling and carbon and all sorts of other things. And then they found out that we were connected. So they invited us both to go over and tour these farms and teach workshops. And Walter ended up speaking to the Prime Minister's cabinet and all of the water organizations in India. I had gotten sadly too sick and had to go home before that meeting. But so I get to India.
అక్కడ వాటర్ ఏమైతున్నాయి ఎక్కడ పోశారు వాటర్ ఎక్కడికి వస్తున్నాయి వచ్చిన వాటర్ ఎక్కడ వెళ్తాయి.
So full circle, it's been an amazing ride, and I am just so grateful that so many people have taken me in along the way and taught me and accepted me for who I am without a whole bunch of credentials after my name, and I'm just, you can see by my story that I have no idea from day to day what the next phone call might bring. So happy to be here with all of you, and happy to questions or comments or whatever you like.
Good.
Thank you, Didi. That was wonderful. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Didi. And what we'll do, I've got a couple of questions that have been brought up already on the chat box. So maybe if you got questions, you could type them in there. I got one that kind of is one of mine, and it ties in with what Isabel talked about there. She said, is everyone familiar with the rain simulator, or do we need to explain it more? And of course, there's the bread and the flour example too that kind of shows that. But I was also going to ask, because I've heard you talk about rehydrating the land, and my question is like, what does that mean? And what would it mean to New Mexico, this dry deserty state and whatnot? So maybe we can talk a little bit about rehydrating the land.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So really it goes back to soil health principles as a way of thinking about the landscape. And I'll go back even to that very first picture of the the grass on one side and kind of a desert on the other. And that was done by holistic plant grazing, and that was in Africa, in Zimbabwe, the Karoo region of southern Africa, with grazing sheep. And essentially, people have shown this all around the world, including in a lot of places in New Mexico, that if you manage a landscape in the way that nature would manage it, basically, which includes diversity and includes living roots in the ground all year round, green growth as much of the year as possible, little or no disturbance if whenever possible, so no till if you're growing crops, that those are what happens with the soil is the plant roots go down, give off sugars, some of the part of the sugar that they're making for them to grow themselves. They give it out through their roots, start feeding the life underground. And that life underground there's all kinds of processes basically that start sticking that sand, silt, and clay together into this sponge. So these loose sand, silt, and clay particles that would slide around and wouldn't really hold water like the flower become this underground infrastructure. And the deeper the roots and the longer that a landscape has had a chance to recover that way, or to start, it's not really just recovering, it's actually doing its thing, the deeper that sponge will go and the more water it will hold. So when a landscape starts to hold water, it can grow more and it can grow deeper roots. So it's this beneficial cycle that you start getting both water at the surface for plants, but also refilling aquifers, the capacity to hold water when it rains, the capacity to store water in between rains, longer green growing season, more shade. That green growth is transpiring, which cools the air, which means less evaporation. So all of these things build on each other, and you end up with, you can take a landscape that is very dry and turn it into something where there is year-round water. So Precious Piri, who I'm going to be doing a workshop with tomorrow, which you can see you can sign up for at landandleadership.org. She has done this in Zimbabwe on a grand scale, working with Alan Savory and others. And they have had rivers that were dry most of the year that are now running year round, that have extended their length of the wet part of the river rather than just being a dry creek. So we're seeing incredible stories from around the world.
Good, thank you. Next question from Valerie. You asked about the carbon numbers. Do you want to say, do you want to unmute and ask a little bit more about that? You're on mute there, Valerie.
Yes, I'm just was getting my microphone.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'm not being familiar at all with the numbers, or actually I'm really illiterate about the composition of the dirt and the land. So I did not know what it's because you hear carbohydrate, so carbohydrate is that. So I was a bit confused, and I did not know if it was.
Yes, and you've got that right, that the carbohydrates which is what a plant makes when it's photosynthesizing, right? And which we think of carbohydrates as bread or potatoes, but it's actually the sugars that are in plants. That is how a plant does that is it takes CO2 in the air, in the atmosphere, and it brings it in through little stomata on the leaves and combines it with water that it's taking up from the soil. And it turns it into first itself. So it's taking air and taking CO2 in the air, carbon dioxide in the air, the same stuff that we talk about with climate change, turning it into a plant or a tree. So, and then feeding that to life above ground and below ground. So, and then we become, if we're eating plants, that some of that CO2 is now in us. And when a plant feeds it out to the soil, and then things keep eating it, and the earthworms are made out of that CO2, right? So everything that is living and everything that is dead and everything that's very dead, like fossil fuels are the very dead, right? It's all of that is stored carbon that's not in the atmosphere, and it's all coming from plants. So almost half, I think a little more than half of the dry weight of anything that's living, like if you subtract the water, is carbon. So soil carbon is the living microbes in the soil. It's the plant root hairs. It's carbon in many different forms that life has stored in the soil, and that is basically becomes the glues and the threads that hold together the soil sponge, which then provides all those water benefits.
Thank you.
So we got about 7 minutes for a couple more questions. Rich was asking, what are your reflections on the question you stated about gaining trust with people? So Rich, do you want to say more about that? And if you want to unmute, yeah.
Well, I thought that was a great way to start the conversation. And it's a lot of, we're all agents on the landscape, and we all have different filters that keep us from hearing or not hearing things. And you obviously have practiced at talking to a lot of people. So I was just wondering if you had any reflections on that question.
Thank you very much for bringing that around again. I did want to bring that around again, and I kind of, I do think that it weaves itself through that story, but I'll highlight some things. One is that as a healthcare provider, I was trained in a particular school to listen and shut up and listen, and to pause for a long time before even asking a question. And in that pause, that's when all of the intimate, trusting information starts to come. It's not just what people say right after you ask them a question. If you wait a painfully long time, they will usually then come in with the real story. And when I was traveling with Peter, who is also someone who pauses a long time, but he's kind of like the serious pauser, and I'm like the goofy, enthusiastic pauser, and I think it was a good. And he was would often say, "People like tell you anything," like I couldn't believe how people would open up. So that's one piece about gaining trust, is really letting them show themselves to you.
Thank you.
A couple more things. Another big thing I think is really, really, really sticking by that thing of that you are assuming the best. You're assuming that if someone made a mistake, if someone did something, etc., that you probably don't understand the whole context, and that if maybe you don't even need to, you just assume that they're having a bad day, or that there was a lot more going on than you thought. But that's another piece. Another one, which was really in some ways my learning along the way, was that as I was meeting people from very different contexts, very different politics, etc., I kept bumping into their hearts underneath there, which I'd seen that in the Vermont context, a lot of different kinds of people.
Yeah.
But then I was in parts of the country where people are in a really different mind space. And yet we had this shared aim towards landscape regeneration that just canceled out all of our political differences, religious differences, whatever it was. We were able to get together and work on these projects. And that was so important to see that happening. And that's a big part of what I try to get across to people.
Well, as a community-based planner and educator, that all totally resonates with me. Another thing about, have a thick skin, have a thick skin's your second point. Different way of saying it, of course. But the benefit of the doubt, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for your question.
So we got two more, and then we should close for tonight. The next one is from Madge Brett. So Madge Brett. And it says, let's turn my arroyo dirt into a slice of bread. What are the steps, the ingredients, the process? Madge Brett, do you want to say anything more about that? And you're muted still, yeah.
I'm feeling a little abashed because I think your first question answered mine, but it wouldn't harm to restate it. So I'd love to hear again how I turn my arroyo of non-nutrient, non-growing dirt into true soil. What are the steps?
So, I mean, the really simple answer is that plants do it.
Yeah.
So, and that when we break and turn the soil upside down, et cetera, or do too much weeding or leave the soil bare, the plants can't do it. And in a place like New Mexico, you may need to use some water to get it started. And it's very counterintuitive. So people say, oh, we don't have enough water to grow cover crops, for example. We don't have enough water to have lawns or to have, to plants in outside our houses. We should just put stones. But to the extent that you can figure out how to do that and to plant things that know how to survive without a lot of water, those will create the conditions for the next generation of plants that know how to survive in a little bit cooler environment, a little bit more water, because there will be a cooler environment with a little more water once you have that shading and roots and the soil sponge starts to develop. And each generation of plants makes the conditions for the next generation of plants. So we're not trying to keep it in a certain place. We're trying to allow it to develop and evolve. And so when you see a weed growing, that weed is telling you what the conditions are and what can grow. So you can either leave the weeds to do their work. And this is this whole thing about non-native plants and invasive plants. Those plants are the first responders. They're the things that can come in, that can grow, that can get those sugars down to start feeding the microbes, that can have a deep taproot to reach the water further down. So if you don't want those, then find something that's very similar that is native, because it's that type of plant that can do the work. And those will go away, and other ones will come in once the sponge starts to develop.
Thank you. That was lovely.
Great. Thank you. And the one question was about the registration for with Precious and you tomorrow. And Christina, if all of you can see on the chat box there, you push that, you'll see the registration address, and that's at 10 o'clock tomorrow our time. So it's landandleadership.org is the website, and you can register.
Yeah, and if someone wants to just check that and make sure that, so it should be there. If you go onto courses and then click on that, it'll take you to a list of courses, and that is one of them. Good.
So that's the last questions for now that are up here. We got about 5 minutes to close, 4 minutes to close. So Didi, I might have you say anything that you wanted to finish up. Is there any comments that you have for closure?
What I would love to do is to hear new questions from people. I love to leave unanswered questions at the end. I don't know if you had something else you wanted to close with, but that's one of my favorite ways, is because when we leave questions unanswered, first of all, it breaks up this idea that I'm some sort of expert, which I'm not. But it also leaves us with things that we want to go figure out ourselves. And that's what I want, is for people to get curious.
Good, very good. Oh, Rich, you've got something? Yeah.
Yeah, how I know you're a healer, with medicine. And how do you see the relationship with traditional knowledge and medicine and soils? Keeping healthy soils.
So I don't know if that's one that for me to answer or not answer. If we're starting the not answer, then we'll leave that one as.
No,
but question. I guess my book, The Ecology of Care, kind of ties it all together.
Okay, I'm gonna get it.
Thanks.
And a couple last thoughts here. Isabel says we need zero budget farming in New Mexico. And Valerie said, I'd be curious to talk about Mustangs, land management, and keeping healthy soil. And so those might be those questions for people to think about and reflect on. We'll go ahead. We got just a couple minutes. Do you want to say anything about that one, that last one, Didi?
About Mustangs?
Mustang, land management, and keeping healthy soil in 1 minute or less.
So the one thing that I know about horses is that they have two sets of teeth as opposed to one. I mean, this isn't the only thing I know about horses. I used to ride horses, but they have, different jaw structure, and they can nibble things down much tighter than other grazing animals, or than many other grazing animals. So managing them, you have to kind of keep in mind, managing them is different than managing cattle. I understand there are some people who are doing successful holistic grazing, holistic plant grazing, which is really a decision-making process that Jeff can teach you, and probably some other folks on this call. So it's not about, there isn't like a way that you do things. It's about watching the conditions. You try something, you watch, you adjust. And you really need to make sure that the grass stays long enough and has a long enough recovery period to start filling in and becoming more diverse, etc. But I'm probably not the best person to answer that, other than give you those few hints.
Well, thank you, Didi, for being on our soil stories tonight and sharing with us. Really appreciate that a lot. I'd like to just really quick end up with our next speaker on July 21st. Our next soil stories at 5:30 is Brent Van Dyke. He's been on, I think he's still on tonight. I've known Brent for a couple of years. I just have a lot of respect for him. He has been working with conservation districts for many, many years. He's just gotten off being past president of the National Association of Conservation Districts. So for all the districts in the United States, going over to like Guam and, the Puerto Rico, so just all over the, the U.S. Country, the states and territories. So he just served on that. He continues to serve as government affairs with the New Mexico Association of Conservation Districts. And, all of us are really here because, or the New Mexico Soil Health Act, what brings this opportunity for us to be together tonight. And, our team of 4 people worked really hard on that. But I tell you what, every time there was a committee meeting or some kind of legislative meeting last year when we were doing this legislation, Brent was there, Debbie Hughes was there, who's the executive director with NMACD, and Jim Berlier was there. He was the president of NMACD last year. So the 3 of them gave amazing testimony, and we've got a bill that's been passed into law. And so I just have to give a lot of credit for what Brent and that team of people from the conservation districts have done. So anyway, Brent will be on next week, and on July 21st at 5:30, and he'll talk about his soil story. So thank you all for being with us tonight. I don't know if Christina or Isabel, do either of you have anything to say to finish? I'm done.
Just thank you very much, Didi. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks to you all for inviting me, and good to meet some of you here.
Thank you all, and we'll see you all later. And thanks for all the work that everybody's doing out there in the world. Okay, good night.